Theodore Anderson,
And where do you live?
13 Danforth Street, Hoosick Falls.
Have you lived in Hoosick Falls all your life, or did
All
you?
my life.
All your life, have been a native.
A native.
All right. Now, before you tell us about the service, will you tell us a little about what was going on before you got in this service?
I was a student at Hoosick Falls High School. And in September, October 1943, along with most of my male classmates, I joined the New York State State Guard. Graduated in June of '43, and the next morning we all left for Camp Smith in Peekskill, New York, for 10 days. By the end of that 10 days, I was ready to stay home. I wasn't interested in going in the Army after that. In July 16th, '43, we left Hoosick Falls, and I was the leader of the Selective Service Contingent.
That you were drafted then?
Oh, yes.
Oh, I see.
A good number of us had to have a deferment in order to finish the senior year of high school. We went to Camp Upton on Long Island, and here we were, like everyone else, all the tests before you get assigned. So on the basis of 12 words a minute in typing, I was sent to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Field Artillery, to become a clerk. I didn't realize it then, but that was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. So we were at Fort Bragg for 17 weeks, half the time learning to be a cannoneer and the other half learning to be a clerk. After that, got home for New Year's 1944 for 10 days, and then back to Fort Meade, Maryland, getting preparation before we went to Europe. Went overseas on a Liberty ship called the Anna Arundel, and this was the first time out after having been torpedoed. So every time a good-sized wave would hit the ship and there was a bang, everybody was figuring, are we going to stay up or are we going back down again? We landed in Berry Docks in Wales, which is near Cardiff. And the first thing I remember when I woke up that morning was hearing this very high-pitched whistle. So when we got on deck, looked out, and here's this little bitty engine pulling these little railroad cars around, which were full-sized there, but not to us. We were there for a month, and then I was sent to Kensington, which is a suburb of London. And this is where General Eisenhower had his headquarters. We got there late in the afternoon, and the corporal took us to mess. And when we came back, he asked us if we knew where we were. And we were assigned to the 6803rd Service Company. So I figured I was going to be moving garbage cans around, that sort of thing. But what actually was, it was SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces, which was General Eisenhower's headquarters. So that was a lot better than having to mess around with the garbage cans. I went to G1, which is personnel. So we handled all the troops coming over, all the troops building up for the invasion, and later on we were responsible for prisoners of war, and then to ship all the troops back home again. I was sent to forward headquarters at Portsmouth in a dried out swamp, and I was one of 2 enlisted men in the compound where Eisenhower's headquarters were. In fact, I could have thrown a golf ball and hit his trailer from my tent. In 944, we went.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
That was getting ready for the invasion? Is that...
The invasion had already happened.
Oh, it happened.
Yeah.
I see.
In 944, we went across the channel in an LST, and we ended up on Utah. And from Utah, we went to a place called Julieville, which originally was a rich man's summer village, and also it had a very large TB sanitarium. But there were no TB patients there when we got there. because that's where most of the offices were while we stayed. And then we went from there to Versailles, and we were in Versailles about 7 months, right across from the palace. And I was walking on the street one day, and I met this soldier. We shook hands, and we had no idea who either of us was. So were you here, were you there, were you somewhere else in the United States? Finally, we ended up asking, where'd you come from? And I told him I was from Hoosick Falls. He says, I am too, and it was Pete with it. Pete was in the anti-aircraft group at the headquarters. I never saw him after that again until we got home.
Huh, that's interesting.
In May of 22nd, 45, an officer and 2 other GIs and myself, we went to Reims, France to catch a plane. And we flew from Reims to Frankfurt. Going over the mountains, we hit an air pocket, and it ended up that we were 50 feet off the top of the mountain when the plane picked up and went back up again. And all I could think of was my mother was going to get a telegram the next morning, but thankfully that didn't happen. This was right after the troops went into Frankfurt, and we had the $64 question. If you got caught talking to a civilian, it cost you $64. So, but a lot of people did, because there was all kinds of GI clothing hanging on the lines at the civilian homes. Before I got home, I was fortunate. I had a chance to go to Switzerland for 10 days. 7 days in Switzerland and 3 days travel time. A couple of things I remember was everything was rationed. We got 6 pieces of chocolate and 1 glass of milk. Everything was paid for before we were allowed in, and we could only bring in $25 because so many people had been involved in the black market. They had thousands of dollars, and they were afraid they'd get in there and bankrupt the city, or the country, I mean. Chanel number 5, in the gallon, sealed, $5. But we had no way to get the stuff home. While I worked in Frankfurt, I worked in the IG Farben building. And this was the largest office building on the continent at that time. IG Farben was the owner of Bear Aspirin. So finally, the great day came, and we got on a train and went from Frankfurt to Le Havre. And the tracks were so bad that the guys would get out and walk alongside the train. It went that slow. We got in tents in Le Havre. We used to let the little French kids steal our coal. And there was 2 little girls and a little boy would come every morning. And they had 1 coat between the 3 of them. And they had 3 shoes. And so the kids would take turns wearing the clothes. So you can see why we felt bad. And some of the guys would take candy bars and put them in the coal pile, and the kids would find them. Of course, our officers weren't too happy with us. Pardon me, but nevertheless, we did it. We got on another Liberty ship called the Sea Perch. Don't know the history of this one, so I don't know if that had been torpedoed or not. 1,500 troops on this ship. When you'd see a movie on deck, half of the people would be seeing it right, and the other half would be on the other side of the screen and see it backward. So we only had about four films, so when you got bored with seeing it right, you'd try and get on the side where you see it backwards to make it be a little different anyhow. We ended up at Fort Dix and met George Scott. Poor George's paperwork had all messed up, so he'd been there a week or so before I did, and he went home the day before I did. Well, by the way, that trip from Le Havre took us 11 days because of a really bad storm we got into. So when I got home, I was home about 4 days. I went back to the Grand Union, where I'd been a part-time butcher's helper, to see if I was going to get my job back, and I wasn't. But then they told me that there was a job in Oneida, so I went over there, and I didn't even get in the door. They hired me on the spot. So I worked there full-time, decided that I needed my math, which I didn't finish up, so I went back to high school for another year, and I took geometry and intermediate algebra. Then I ended up going to the predecessor of Hudson Valley Community College, which was Veterans Vocational School. But when we went, it was a little bit different. It was strictly just veterans. And when somebody would act up in class, 4 or 5 guys would holler at him to shut up, because we were there for only one thing: we got to get an education so we can go get a job. Also, for every hour in the classroom, we had another hour in the lab. So when we came out the door, we knew what the tools were for and how to use them.
And what were you studying there exactly?
Radio and communications. We had our own FM radio station, and we had our own ham station. So, which they don't have at Hudson Valley today. A shame, because many of the fellows went to the local radio and TV stations after graduation, and there's nothing in the area that trains for that sort of thing now. I got my ham ticket in 1963. All the guys said I was the most active unlicensed ham there was, because I knew all the stuff was in the magazines and talked to everybody, but I couldn't talk on the radio. And since I retired in 1986...
Well, what did you do then?
I went to work for GE for 35 years.
Oh, in Schenectady?
In Schenectady. I went to work in the general engineering laboratory at first, and that was a product laboratory. They developed the washers, the dryers, the flat irons, the toasters, and all that sort of thing. And then they decided they weren't going to have as much product, so a lot of us got essentially laid off, but I was transferred to the research lab, which later became the Research and Development Center in Niskayuna. So I was very fortunate, because in February I was told that if I didn't get a job at the research lab, I didn't have a job. And I was supposed to get married in April.
And of what year was that?
1940, or 51. 55. 19, I went to work for GE in 51, and I got married in 55.
I see.
And so for the next 35 years I commuted. For a while with a bunch of fellas, and then most of the time by myself. Very happily when that last day came. Commuting and I weren't all that happy to begin with.
As you get older, it gets tougher.
It does, it does. So since retiring, mostly what I've done is taken care of relatives. And then 5 years ago, we sold a big house and got a smaller house. And for the next year, I went back in the house repairing business and rebuilt the house the way we wanted it, with help from a couple of contractors. Oh,
Your wife was a local girl, or?
she lived in that house, the first house we were in, since she was in 5th grade.
And what was her maiden name?
Winters.
Winters?
Pat Winters.
I see. Did you have any children?
No.
No children. All right, and now you're retired and you're living the good life in Hoosick Falls.
That's what they tell me.
That's what they tell you. Let me ask you a little about the service. Your job was basically like a personnel director. You know, making sure that the personnel of all these things were taken care of.
Well, that's what the officers did. I worked in the message center. So we received every piece of correspondence coming and going. Much of it classified. I worked under a warrant officer, and if the top secret material wasn't addressed to a particular officer, then he would open it, and then he'd give it to me. And then I had a special log that I logged it in, and then I had to keep track of it as long as we had it. And then when it went out, then I had an out log. Now the rest of the people in the group were not supposed to look at the equipment or the information, just he and I.
Oh, I see. So
Before the invasion started, one day, 4 master sergeants with machine guns and a full colonel came in, and the colonel had a big brown wrapped package, and he wanted to know where General Barker was, the general that was the head of our group. So I took the 5 of them to the general's office, and pretty soon the warrant officer was called, and Hank came back with the package open. He says, "Okay, Andy, go over in the corner with your top secret log. Nobody watches you, and you can get the information on the flyleaf of every one of these, but don't look at anything else." And these were 5 bound leather volumes of Overlord. This was the plan of the invasion of Europe. I just sneaked over to the first page, and it said on the bottom, "D-Day will be." And as I lifted up the page, the warrant officer caught me, so I didn't find out when D-Day was going to be.
I see. So it was really, you were in charge of these messages that were coming in all the time and making sure that they were kept confidential and so forth. Very interesting work, and you were right there, right at the headquarters of Eisenhower.
Yeah.
So you were right there where the action was.
I never talked to him, but I saw him many times. I saw Air Marshal Tedder. He was in charge of Air Force for the Allies. Bradley, the pearl handle man that got in trouble.
Patton.
Georgie Patton. David Niven. He came in one morning and there was MP outside the door. And he came and he says, "Andy, I got a British officer out here." So I went out and I recognized him, but I've never seen anybody as dirty as that man was. He came right out of the trenches. And he wanted to see the assistant to the general I worked for was a British general, and he wanted to see him. So I took him up to him. The next morning I happened to walk out in the hall, and he just came in. Now he's all cleaned up with his mustache all waxed, and I commented that he looked much better that day than the day previous to that. Glenn Miller and the band, they were assigned to us for administration, so we got to meet Glenn and Ray McKinley a number of times. And when Bruce Cathcart from North Hoosick came to visit me in Versailles, I took him to Paris, gave him a tour, didn't tell him that Glenn and the band was there. So I took him, and we were walking down the street to the Red Cross Club. He heard the music. And I pushed him in the door. I have never drank so much coffee or eaten so many donuts as I did that afternoon. But we had to leave him there because Bruce had to get back to the hospital on the other side of Paris. So some of the things weren't so pleasant, but there were some things that were really interesting.
Yeah, that was an interesting job. Well, is there anything else you'd like to say about Hoosick Falls or about the service?
The only thing that we had a lot of fun was the first 3 nights that we were at Bushy Park, which is in Kensington where we were stationed. Bombers moved, so we watched the Germans drop the bombs on London, and when they got too close, then we'd run in the air raid shelter. Crazy young kids.
Yeah.
And then later on, when the buzz bombs came, you didn't run because you couldn't tell where they were going. It echoed between the buildings, so you hoped and prayed that you were all going to be all right.
How old were you when you were over there?
I went in the service 19.
I see. So you're young. You were in your early 20s
when I came out. Right.
When he came out. Well, we thank you a lot for coming down and telling your story. We appreciate it very, very much.